Hi guys, how's it going? Miller here. A few people lately have been asking questions about how to make a pike and shot army, or have started a pike and shot army, and they're not too sure on the way about going about it. Obviously I've got quite a large English Civil War army anyway, so I'm going to break down what I can and go through everything from what the officers were to how the regiments were organised and what makes up a regiment and how an army would be organised. So hopefully that this can be used for any of you guys that are thinking of starting, or have already got one and just want to have a better idea of how it's organised, and hopefully this can do you some help. So let's go into it. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Throughout the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, gunpowder had become a vital asset in the war, or the way that war was fought. And the armies were broke down into four main real components. You would have your pike, you would have shot, there would be cavalry, and then there'd be artillery. There are a few extra exceptions, things like dragoons and cuirassiers and things like that, but they are still parts of the cavalry. They just use different tactics. The way that they would work is that you would have a main corps of pike, which would be surrounded by artillery. They would be surrounded by shot, and that the pike would be used to defend the muskets from the cavalry. But then the way that the cavalry would be used would be to make the pikemen want to protect the muskets by making them form something known as a hedgehog or schiltron. And that being like that, they would then be susceptible to extra fire from things like artillery or extra shot. The idea being that if you could get the infantry immobile, then you could shoot them to pieces. But the only problem being is that artillery, as powerful as it is still not 100% accurate, and it still can be quite hard to hit unless you get close. So we'll go now and we'll break down what makes up a regiment. Okay, so this, in the English Civil War, or the 30 Years' War, is what would be known as a Regiment of Foot. The 30 Years' War was a lot larger scale war than was made in the English Civil War, so the units would have probably been a lot bigger. But for the sake of this, I'm going to be talking about mainly the English Civil War, but this is also the same for the 30 Years' War. They would still be organised the same way, there would just be larger numbers in the units. So a regiment would be made up, especially in the later parts of the Civil War, as a centre unit of pike and then two wings of muskets. Earlier on in the war, it would have been a case of 2-to-1 on the musketeers. So there would have been 2 pikemen to every 1 musketeer. And as the war progressed and munitions became a lot more available and there was a lot more guns available, Bristol being a big help for the creation of guns, by the end of the Civil War, majority of the guns on the battlefield were Bristol made and had either been made by the Royalists and captured by the Parliamentarians, or were still just in the Royalist hands. So for the sake of this, a regiment is made up of pike and shot. Like I was saying at the start, there was 2 pikemen to every shot, but by the end of the war, there was 1 pikeman to 2 shot. The regiment itself would be divided into 10 companies, and each company would have an officer. The first company would be by the colonel, who would have bought and paid for the recruitment of the men, the uniforms, would have supplied all the munitions and everything like that. Armour and things like that in the war would have been mainly scavenged, if not bought by the officers. The second company would be by the lieutenant colonel. He would then have so many men under him. There would then be the major, and then the captains and the lieutenants. Each of these commands would have their own flag, their own ensign. And if you look on this one, each regiment would have its own design on its flag. So this is Rainsborough's regiment. The major, sorry, not the major, the colonel would have just a flag just of that colour. And then the lieutenant colonel would have one that had just the St. George's Cross. So it would still be the colour, but with the St. George's Cross in it. And then depending on what the regiment was, you'd have these things known as devices. So in some regiments, a major would then have just one of these sort of wiggly flames or lightning bolts. And then gradually it would then change. So for Rainsboroughs it works that you have so many lightning bolts makes up the rest of the officers. But in other ones you would have the things, like I said, called devices. So a major might have the lightning bolt, but a captain would have a single star. Excuse me. And then the lieutenants would have so many stars, and it would go all the way up. So you'd have a 1st to 7th lieutenant. So there would be 7 devices. Now, it's quite hard to show it on a pike unit like this, but they would all be formed up. Sorry, they would all be formed up along the front. So you'd have so many flags along the front, and there would be for each of the companies. You might have some in the case of having them there by the muskets, but it's not likely, because having burning embers next to the flags would just mean that the flags would just catch fire. So they were mainly in the pike blocks. And to be fair, not all of them would probably be seen on the battlefield, especially not in sieges. So they'd probably be off somewhere being in storage, and you'd mainly only see them in the battle. And what would happen is the ensigns would come out at the start of the battle as the pikemen are advancing, and they would wave their colours like they're doing in this video. And this would symbolise, we're here, we're ready to fight. Okay, and it would let you know, sort of like with Wars of the Roses or things like that, or any other period where you would have a flag, but you're taunting the enemy to show them that you are here and you're ready to fight. In command, you would have the colonel. Now, the colonel would normally use something like a partisan or some other decorative spear, one like this one. And then you would then have the major, or the lieutenant colonel, or any of the sergeants would carry a halberd. And it was all about a status symbol. The idea being that you had the more grander weapon so that you knew their rank, sort of like having a ranking insignia on your arm. You didn't really have that. Another way of identification in the Civil War was the uniform, but the problem with the uniforms was that not everybody had a set uniform. Like I said before, the uniforms were supplied by the officer. So it was down to them to supply what the colour of the regiment was, and that normally depended on the colour that was readily available. For instance, for Rainsboroughs, it is red. We're not 100% sure on that, because a lot of the colours being red are from the new model army, when the whole army became red. Every regiment would also have drummers. So they would have so many drummers that would be there, and they would drum the beat, the same in any other regiment. If any of you have ever done anything like Napoleonics or anything like that, if you are in the middle of a battle, you can't hear the orders. So the musketeers wouldn't be able to hear the orders of the man shouting so far down the line. So the drums were there to signal the orders for the men to follow. As the fighting would commence, the officers, especially the drummers and the ensigns, would fall back. So they would shout colours to the rear, and they would fall back to the back of the pike block to risk, or to save the risk of the colours being captured, or from any of the officers dying that would need to command the unit. You may still have the sergeants quite close to the front, but if you can imagine 300-400 men with pikes clashing in together like that, you can imagine there's going to be some pointy sticks going where you don't want them. But that's essentially how you make up a regiment. So this is what would make up a regiment of horse. Regiments of horses work in the same way as they have companies, but they're not known as companies, they're known as troops of horses. A standard regiment in the English Civil War was made up of 6 troops of horse, and each troop would have its own captain. And then each regiment of horse would be led by a lieutenant colonel. The idea being that so many troops would be able to maneuver, and they'd all be under one command. So I've only got one flag or one ensign in this. I haven't actually got a flag on this, but it would be. But you'd obviously have 6 per regiment. And the armour would just be made up of, again, buff coat and possibly a chest plate or a lobster pot helmet or a 3-bar helmet. Cavaliers are obviously known for wearing the big floppy hats with the feathers and things like that. They would probably have worn that, but, you know, if you were in the middle of the battle, I know which one I would choose over the floppy hat. Some regiments did have larger troops of horses, so Cromwell's regiment is known for having twice the size, so he would have had 12 troops of horses towards the end of the war. And that was just because he'd become more and more of an established colonel and was given more and more chances, or more and more prestige, to be able to make his units grander. Okay, so this is another unit that you would start seeing on the battlefield throughout the 17th century. These are known as Dragoons. They act a lot differently to the ones that would work, or dragoons that you would know in the Napoleonic period. They were, in that sort of period, they were more a light cavalry that would be used to advance and harass the enemy. These would still be used as harassment, but they would move up to a position and would be dismount and then fire upon the enemy from the hedges. If not that, then they would be used for baggage trains and defending of positions, picket duty and things like that. So they're always a good thing to have on the battlefield. If you're making them for an army, the best thing and the thing that you will need to do for them though is you will need to have 2 sets for them. So you will need to have this and you will need to have a dismounted version. Some people also like to have horse holders as kind of like a scenic base for when you've dismounted. Something I've looked at, but I have not got round to doing. And as for the dismounted, I haven't also finished painting some, but they're definitely something to add to an army if you are thinking of using them. Okay, so I've moved to handheld now just because it's easier, so I apologise for any shaky cam. So a battalion would be made up of multiple regiments. There would be between 2 to 4 to maybe 5, depending on the scale of the battle. Each regiment would have its own colonel, and there would be an elected colonel throughout the regiment that would be in charge of the battalion. So, for instance, this one I've got Lawrence Crawford's Regiment of Foot and Rainsborough's Regiment of Foot, and they're being commanded by Rainsborough, who is the mounted officer behind. They would also have cannons, would be either under control of the battalion, or would be under control of the Grand Battery, depending on what the battle was. Cannon weren't always at the battle. Cannon were more used for, especially the heavier cannon, were more used for sieges. So it's not likely to have seen tons of cannon at a battle, and if they were, they would have only been really light cannons, because trying to move a big heavy cannon in hard ground, let alone muddy ground, is hard enough. So again, you would then treat each of these regiments as they would move as a single unit. So this pike block would move advance and the shot would move beside it. And in the case that there would be an attack on this regiment would form hedgehog, which I will show you again in a minute. And that this regiment would again act independently, musket and pike moving up together. You wouldn't want your pike leaving the musket because they would be susceptible to that chance of being attacked by cavalry. Again, the same would kind of happen with the cannon. If the cannon's advancing, you want the pike and the shot to protect the cannon. Because if your cannon gets attacked or destroyed or captured, you've lost your cannon, which at the time, cannons would not have been a cheap thing. So the idea of the battle was to 1, loot the baggage train, 2, defeat the enemy, and for 3, capture any munitions or guns or anything you can at the end of the battle. So the idea of sacking the guns or spiking the guns or anything like that would have been a less of a common thing, but you would definitely want to capture any munitions or anything that you could. There's a battle known as Runway Down where the Cavaliers or the Royalists managed to capture the parliamentarian guns on top of the hill and turn them on the parliamentarian infantry down the hill. So as you can see, artillery in a battle can always be useful if used properly. So you must keep the guns protected as well as the shot, as the shot are also going to be the ones to cause damage. Okay, so this essentially is what you would need to have an army, but this is obviously a large army, but this is just to show you the sort of thing that you can use or how an army could be made up. So as I mentioned before, you had a regiment, which is comprised of a pikeman with 2 shot, and then you have the same repeated multiple times across the table. You have troops of horse, or a regiment of horse made up of so many troops. Excuse me. And then a battalion is made up of multiple regiments and supported cannon. So for instance here I've got one commander who's in charge of 2 cannons and 2 regiments, and then I've got another commander in charge of a regiment and another 2 cannons, another commander here who's in charge of this regiment and this regiment, and so on and so forth. So you have a commander in charge of so many regiments, So many pieces of artillery. Now, in certain games, the way you can also do it, because also in the period you would have had things known as commander's shot. So that's what these are. So these are shot that would work independently from the pikes, but as I mentioned before, they're always at the risk of being attacked by the cavalry. The same with these. So these here are, because I use pike and shot, these are storming parties. So these are just, again, small units of commander's shot that are used for storming breaches and things like that. You can also see up the back here, I've got 2 large batteries of artillery. Again, like I mentioned before, large cannons like these would have always been used. They could have been used in a battle, but not very handy to use for accuracy. Definitely good for ripping holes into infantry if you can hit them, but a lot more ideal for using on sieges or attacking specific areas where you don't mind, you don't need the accuracy. You're going for field of fire as opposed to accuracy. So these were brigades of infantry. Now, a brigade of horse, you can use horse with infantry together, but in a large army like this, it would make more sense because the cavalry would work independently from the infantry. So here I've got 1 commander in charge of 3 regiments of horse. In a civil war battle, and in the 30 Years' War, what would tend to happen is both sides of cavalry would attack either side. There would be a fight, there would be a victory. What tended to happen was the cavalry that won would drive off the ones that had lost and would go and loot the baggage train. But that was a show of ill discipline. At the Battle of Naseby, it's known that Rupert's cavalry drove off the parliamentarian cavalry on one of the wings, but then carried on and looted the baggage train and followed on further into a town. The problem with that then is if they've gone, they then can't come back and fight again. Whereas the parliamentarian cavalry, and especially Cromwell's cavalry, was well known for the discipline to be able to come back around, regroup and fight again. So if you manage to drive away the enemy's cavalry, your cavalry can then come back and start attacking the infantry, which then pins them down. They can't move. You start shooting them with the artillery and the shot. That way you are gradually wearing down the infantry. All it takes is for one wing to start crumbling, and then the rest start falling like dice. On this side again, I've got another troop of cavalry. This one obviously, however, has a troop of dragoons, which you will have seen what I've spoken about earlier. Again, followed by a commander. So in this army, I've got 4 main commanders and 1 general. The general has given his commanders the orders at the start of the battle, and it's down to them commanders to fulfill those orders in the battle. They'll still have messengers or runners. They wouldn't really be known as aides-de-camps like they would be in Napoleonic time, but they would, if needs be, send their messages to the commanders to say, this is what I need you to do. It doesn't work like you see in computer games where the general can see a man on the opposite side of the battlefield and order him to quickly take a position. That general needs to get commands to their commanders that filter down the chain of command. But I hope this gives you an idea of the sort of formation you need if you want to have an army like this. Okay, so there are plenty of different rules to choose from for the period. You've got pike and shot, which is the ones that I prefer to use, with the To Kill a King supplement, which have been released by Warlord Games. You've got for King and Parliament, which is the rule set written by Simon Miller, which is based on To the Strongest but adapted for English Civil War. You've got The Kingdom is Ours, which I think is one that Bicorne sell, but I don't know if they're the ones who made it, which is a bit different, where it's not you go, I go, it's random activation. So I think it's kind of like a bolt action sort of thing to it. Looks really cool. Again, not had a chance to use them. There's Pikeland Lament, which is a lot smaller as a game. It's a good way to start if you've not done it before. So it's a good way to build your army up. So you can build a force for that and gradually build it up for bigger games like Pike and Shot or To Kill a King, or not To Kill a King, for King and Parliament. And I can't think of any others. I know that there's one that the Ancient Battles, Warhammer Ancient Battles used to do, which is called English Civil War. Dom from Boots on the Table really recommends that one. Lee from Battle Bunker, his family, I think, have played Victory Without Quarter, They've recommended to me. Again, I've not had a chance to play it, but any recommendations on any games I will definitely have a look at, and if ever I get a chance to play them, 100%. So don't forget to put anything in the description below on anything you recommend. As for reference material, there's different websites online. I will definitely put in the description below. There's one called BCW. I can't remember what BCW stands for, but they are fantastic for regiment information. A lot of the regiments they've managed to get, they've used source material and know the regiment colours of the coats, the flags, which are very hard to find out sometimes. I know things like Marston Moor, there's a lot of information on Marston Moor, so the regiments that were there, the sizes of them, who was in command, the coats, the colours. But a lot of the other battles, the smaller battles, other than things like Naseby and stuff, are quite hard to find. There's a few websites as well. There's a fella who has a website called Keep Your Powder Dry. Fantastic website. I don't know how many regiments he's done, but he does his in 15mm or 18mm. And he's done some fantastic work on English Civil War stuff, and he's doing most of the regiments. He's also got on there a list of the different regiments and the coat colours. So it will have parliamentarians, royalists, and the Covenanters, and will say the different colours of the coats. Definitely worth checking that out. Again, I will put a link in the description below. As for books, plenty of books out there. I mainly stick to a couple that I've got. I know the Osprey have a few books, probably worth checking out. I started with a book by a man called a book called The English Civil War. I think it was what it was called, but it's by a man called Philip Haythornthwaite. And a lot of the illustrations and stuff that have been in that book have been used to sculpt a lot of the figures that you'll see in some of the ranges. So I know Warlord have got a few of the sculpts that are similar to his paintings, or the artist's paintings. It also gives you breakdowns on, again, the regiments like I've mentioned before, and also the postures and the tactics that would be used. So how a pike would be used, how a musket would be loaded and fired. Definitely worth checking out. And there's also a book that I picked up, or I got for Christmas a couple of years ago, called The Atlas of the English Civil War. Again, I'll put it in the description. I can't remember what it's called. But again, it is battles throughout the Civil War, maps of how they were fought, army lists for the battles, and just a general campaign and a map of the country, and shows you manoeuvres up and down the country. Definitely worth picking up. But yeah, definitely worth picking them up. As for manufacturers, there are plenty of manufacturers out there that do 28mm English Civil War. There's plenty that have also started doing smaller scales. As for 28mm, Warlord Games, if you're starting, definitely pick up a starter box, or the starter battalion, or the For King and Country, what's Killer King? For King and Country starter box if you're starting for pike and shot. If you don't want to do pike and shot, don't get the Killer King one, or the For King and Country, because that comes with the rules. But their plastics are old. They're an old sculpt now, but they are great for starting you off. They're cheap. I think it's about £22 for 40 figures. That gives you a regiment. Compared to Games Workshop standards, you know, a single box of figures, don't want to get into that, but definitely worth picking up a box of them. But there's always the expansion. You've got First Call. They've got some fantastic figures. Perry Miniatures, Bicorne, Bloody Miniatures, which came out about a year ago. They've got some really nice sculpts. They've not got a large range, but what they've got coming out is more bespoke and different postures. So they could be more for commands or things like that, or for smaller games like Pikelands Event where you don't have large armies. And really nice figures. Foundry, I'm always getting stuff from Foundry. Not Foundry, Wargames Foundry. That is Foundry. Who else? There's loads. As for smaller scales, 15mm to 18mm, I think 15mm Steel Fist Miniatures have got a really nice range of 15s, but they're on the smaller side, and they can be quite fiddly, but I really like them. I picked them up before. I've shown them on the channel before. 10mm, you've got things like Peter Pig. 6mm Bicorne. I still want to have maybe a 6mm army, maybe a royalist one, but definitely plenty out there. Right guys, so I hope that this breakdown has managed to help anyone who is interested in starting, or has already started but is a bit unsure of how to get into a pike and shot based army. Not the rule set, but the period of conflict known as pike and shot. So that could be 30 Years' War, English Civil War. So, as I've said before, there are some great channels out there that do content for the period. Definitely go check them out. As I've said, in the description. Go check out any of the channels. Check out all the source material that I've used or that I recommend, and crack on with it, guys. It's the only way you're going to be able to get it done. Just get painting, get making, and just enjoy yourself. That's it for now, guys. Bye for now.